Chapter 7. Clouds swarmed the late afternoon sun, and the Oregon sky grew sapphire where still revealed. Cops gathered like bright-eyed crows in the lengthening shadow of the fire tower. Because the tower stood on a ridgeline that marked the divide between county and state property, most of the attending constabulary were county deputies, but 2 state troopers were present as well. With the uniformed troopers was a stocky, late 40-ish brush-cut man in black slacks and a gray herringbone sports jacket. His face was almost pan-flat, his first weak chin, his second chin stronger than the first, and his function unknown to Junior. He would have been the least likely man to be noticed in a 10,000-man convention of non-entities, if not for the port wine birthmark that surrounded his right eye, darkening most of the bridge of his nose, brightening half his forehead, and returning around the eye to stain the upper portion of his cheek. Among themselves, the authorities spoke more often than not in murmurs, or perhaps Junior was too distracted to hear them clearly. He was having difficulty focusing his attention on the problem at hand. Through his mind, odd and disconnected thoughts rolled like slow, greasy eye-of-the-hurricane waves on an ominous sea. Earlier, after sprinting down the fire road, he had been breathing hard when he reached his Chevy, and by the time that he had raced to Spruce Hills, the nearest town, he had spiraled down into this strange condition. His driving became so erratic that a black and white had tried to pull him over, but by then he was a block from a hospital, and he didn't stop until he got there, taking the entry drive too sharply, jolting across the curb, nearly slamming into a parked car, sliding to a stop in a no-parking zone at the emergency entrance, lurching like a drunkard as he got out of the Chevy, screaming at the cop to get an ambulance. Get an ambulance! All the way back to the ridge, sitting up front beside a county deputy and a police cruiser, with an ambulance and other patrol cars racing close behind them, Junior had shaken uncontrollably. When he tried to respond to the officer's questions, his uncharacteristically thin voice cracked more often than not, and he was able to croak only, "Jesus, dear Jesus," over and over. When the highway passed through a sunless ravine, he had broken into a sour sweat at the sight of the bloody, pulsing reflections of the revolving rooftop beacons on the bracketing cut shale walls. Now and then the siren shrieked to clear traffic ahead, and he felt the urge to scream with it, to let loose a wail of terror and anguish and confusion and loss. He repressed the scream, however, because he sensed that if he gave voice to it, he wouldn't be able to silence himself for a long time. Getting out of the stuffy car into air much chillier than it had been when he'd left this place, Junior stood unsteadily as the police and the paramedics gathered around him. Then he led them through the wild grass to Naomi, moving haltingly, stumbling on small stones that the others navigated with ease. Junior knew that he looked as guilty as any man had ever looked this side of the first apple in the perfect garden. The sweating, the spasms of violent tremors, the defensive note that he could not keep out of his voice, the inability to look anyone directly in the eyes for more than a few seconds, all were telltales that none of these professionals would overlook. He desperately needed to get a grip on himself, but he couldn't find a handle. Now here once more to the body of his bride. Livor mortis had already set in, blood draining to the lowest points of her body, leaving the fronts of her bare legs, one side of each bare arm, and her face ghastly pale. Her dead gaze was still surprisingly clear. How remarkable that the impact hadn't caused a starburst hemorrhage in either of her exquisite lavender blue eyes. No blood, just surprise. Junior was aware that all the cops were watching him as he stared down at the body, and he frantically tried to think what an innocent husband would be likely to do or say. But his imagination failed him. His thoughts could not be organized. His inner turmoil boiled ever more fiercely, and the external evidence of it grew more obvious. In the cool air of the fading afternoon, he perspired as profusely as a man already being strapped into an electric chair. He streamed, gushed. He shook, and he was half convinced that he could hear his bones rattling together like the shells of hard-boiled eggs in a roiling cookpot. Had he ever thought he could get away with this? He must have been delusional, temporarily mad. One of the paramedics knelt beside the body, checking Naomi for a pulse, although in these circumstances his action was such a formality that it was almost harebrained. Someone eased in closer beside Junior and said, "How did it happen again?" He looked up into the eyes of the stocky man with the birthmark. They were gray eyes, hard as nail heads, but clear and surprisingly beautiful in that otherwise unfortunate face. The man's voice echoed hollowly in Junior's ears as if coming from the far end of a tunnel, or from the terminus of a death row hallway on the long walk between the last meal and the execution chamber. Junior tipped his head back and gazed up toward the section of broken-out railing along the high observation deck. He was aware of others looking up too. Everyone was silent. The day was morgue still. The crows had flooded the sky, but a single hawk glided soundlessly, like justice with its prey in sight, high above the tower. She was eating dried apricots. Junior spoke almost in a whisper, yet the ridge was so quiet that he had no doubt each of these uniformed but unofficial jurors heard him clearly. Walking around the deck, paused, the view, she leaned, gone. Abruptly, Junior Kane turned away from the tower, from the body of his lost love, dropped to his knees and vomited more explosively than he had ever done in the depths of the worst sickness of his life. Bitter, thick, grossly out of proportion to the simple lunch that he had eaten. Up came a dreadfully reeking vomitus. He was untroubled by nausea, but his abdominal muscles contracted painfully, so tightly that he thought he would be cinched in two. And up came more and still more, spasm after spasm, until he spewed a thin gruel, green with bile, which surely had to be the last of it, but was not, for here was more bile, so acidic that his gums burned from contact with it. Oh God, please no! Still more. His entire body heaving. Choking as he aspirated a piece of something vile, he squeezed his watering eyes shut against the side of the flood, but he could not block out the stench. One of the paramedics had stooped beside him to press a cool hand against the nape of his neck. Now this man said urgently, "Kenny, we've got hematemesis here." Running footsteps heading toward the ambulance. Apparently Kenny, the second paramedic. To become a physical therapist, Junior had taken more than massage classes, so he knew what hematemesis meant. Hematemesis, vomiting of blood. Opening his eyes, blinking back his tears just as more agonizing contractions knotted his abdomen, he could see ribbons of red in the watery green mess that gouted from him. Bright red. Gastric blood would be dark. This must be pharyngeal blood, unless an artery had ruptured in his stomach, torn by the incredible violence of these intransigent spasms, in which case he was puking his life away. He wondered if the hawk had descended in a constricting gyre, just as coming down, but he could not lift his head to see. Now, without realizing when it had happened, he had been lowered from his knees to his right side, head elevated and tilted by one of the paramedics, so he could expel the bile, the blood, rather than choke on it. The twisting pain in his gut was extraordinary. Death raptures, undiminished antiperistaltic waves coursed through his duodenum, stomach, and esophagus. and now he gasped desperately for air between each expulsion without much success. A cold wetness just above the crook of his left elbow, a sting. A tourniquet of flexible rubber tubing had been tied around his left arm to make a vein swell more visibly, and the sting had been the prick of a hypodermic needle. They would have given him an anti-nausea medication. It most likely wasn't going to work quickly enough to save him. He thought he heard the soft swoosh of knife-edge wings slicing the January air. He dared not look up, more in his throat. The agony. Darkness poured into his head as if it were blood rising relentlessly from his flooded stomach and esophagus. Chapter 8. Having completed her English lesson, Maria Elena Gonzalez went home with a plastic shopping bag full of precisely damaged clothes and a smaller paper bag containing cherry muffins for her 2 girls. When she closed the front door and turned away from it, Agnes bumped her swollen belly into Joey. His eyebrows shot up, and he put his hands on her distended abdomen as if she were more fragile than a robin's egg and more valuable than one by Fabergé. "Now?" he asked. "I'd like to tidy up the kitchen first." Pleadingly. "Aggie, no." He reminded her of the Worry Bear from a book she'd already bought for her baby's collection. The Worry Bear carries worries in his pockets, under his Panama hat and in 2 gold lockets, carries worries on his back and under his arms. Nevertheless, dear old Worry Bear has his charms. Agnes's contractions were getting more frequent and slightly more severe, so she said, "All right, but let me go tell Edom and Jacob that we're leaving." Edom and Jacob Isaacson were her older brothers who lived in 2 small apartments above the 4-car garage at the back of the property. "I've already told them," Joey said, wheeling away from her and yanking open the door of the foyer closet with such force that she thought he would tear it off its hinges. He produced her coat as if by legerdemain. Magically, she found her arms in the sleeves and the collar around her neck, though given her size lately, putting on anything other than a hat usually required strategy and persistence. When she turned to him again, he had already slipped into his jacket and snatched the car keys off the foyer table. He put his left hand under her right arm, as though Agnes were feeble and in need of support, and he swept her through the door onto the front porch. He didn't pause to lock the house behind them. Bright Beach in 1965 was as free of criminals as it was untroubled by lumbering brontosaurs. The afternoon was winding down, and the lowering sky seemed to be drawn steadily toward the earth by threads of gray light that reeled westward ever faster over the horizon's spool. The air smelled like rain waiting to happen. The beetle green Pontiac waited in the driveway with a shine that tempted nature to throw around some bad weather. Joey always kept a spotless car, and he probably wouldn't have had time to earn a living if he had resided in some shine-spoiling climate rather than in Southern California. "Are you all right?" he asked as he opened the passenger's door and helped her into the car. "Right as rain." "You're sure?" "Good as gold." The inside of the Pontiac smelled pleasantly of lemons, though the rearview mirror was not hung with one of those tacky decorative deodorizers. The seats, regularly treated with leather soap, were softer and more supple than they had been when the car had shipped out of Detroit, and the instrument panel sparkled. As Joey opened the driver's door and got in behind the steering wheel, he said, "Okay." "Fine as silk." "You look pale." "Fit as a fiddle." "You're mocking me, aren't you?" "You beg so sweetly to be mocked. How could I possibly withhold it from you?" Just as Joey pulled his door shut, a contraction gripped Agnes. She grimaced, sucking air sharply between her clenched teeth. "Oh no," said the Worry Bear. "Oh no." "Good heavens, sweetie, relax. This isn't ordinary pain. This is happy pain. Our little girl's going to be with us before the day is done." Little boy, trust a mother's intuition. A father's got some too. He was so nervous that the key rattled interminably against the ignition plate before at last he was able to insert it. Should be a boy, because then you'll always have a man around the house. You plan to run off with some blonde. He couldn't get the car started because he repeatedly tried to turn the key in the wrong direction. You know what I mean. I'm going to be around a long time yet, but women outlive men by several years. Actuarial tables aren't wrong. Always the insurance agent. Well, it's true, he said, finally turning the key in the proper direction and firing up the engine. Gonna sell me a policy? I didn't sell anyone else today. Gotta make a living. You alright? Scared, she said. Instead of shifting the car into drive, he placed one of his bearish hands over both of her hands. Something feel wrong? I'm afraid you'll drive us straight into a tree. He looked hurt. I'm the safest driver in Bright Beach. My auto rates prove it. Not today. If it takes you as long to get the car in gear as it did to slip that key in the ignition, our little girl will be sitting up and saying Dada by the time we get to the hospital. Little boy, just calm down. I am calm, he assured her. He released the handbrake, shifted the car into reverse instead of into drive, and backed away from the street along the side of the house. Startled, he braked to a halt. Agnes didn't say anything until Joey had taken 3 or 4 deep, slow breaths, and then she pointed at the windshield. The hospital's that way. He regarded her sheepishly. You all right? Our little girl's going to walk backward her whole life if you drive in reverse all the way to the hospital. If it is a little girl, she's going to be exactly like you, he said. I don't think I can handle 2 of you. We'll keep you young. With great deliberation, Joey shifted gears and followed the driveway to the street, where he peered left and then right with the squint-eyed suspicion of a Marine commando scouting dangerous territory. He turned right. Make sure Edom delivers the pies in the morning, Agnes reminded him. Jacob said he wouldn't mind doing it for once. Jacob scares people, Agnes said. No one would eat a pie that Jacob delivered without having it tested at a lab. Needles of rain knitted the air and quickly embroidered silvery patterns on the blacktop. Switching on the windshield wipers, Joey said, It's the first time I've ever heard you admit that either of your brothers is odd. Not odd, dear. They're just a little eccentric. Like water is a little wet. Frowning at him, she said, You don't mind them around, do you, Joey? They're eccentric, but I love them very much. So do I, he admitted. He smiled and shook his head. Those 2 make a worrywart life insurance salesman like me seem just as lighthearted as a schoolgirl. You're turning into an excellent driver after all, she said, winking at him. He was, in fact, a first-rate driver with an impeccable record at the age of 30. No traffic citations, no accidents. His skill behind the wheel and his inborn caution didn't help him, however, when a Ford pickup ran a red traffic light, braked too late, and slid at high speed into the driver's door of the Pontiac. Chapter 9. Rocking as if afloat on troubled waters, abused by an unearthly and tormented sound, Junior Kane imagined a gondola on a black river, a carved dragon rising high at the bow, as he had seen on a paperback fantasy novel featuring Vikings in a longboat. The gondolier in this case was not a Viking, but a tall figure in a black robe, his face concealed within a voluminous hood. He didn't pull the boat with the traditional oar, but with what appeared to be human bones welded into a staff. The river's course was entirely underground, with a stone vault for a sky, and fires burned on the far shore, whence came the tormenting wail, a cry filled with rage, anguish, and fearsome need. The truth, as always, was not supernatural. He opened his eyes and discovered that he was in the back of an ambulance. Evidently, this was the one intended for Naomi. They would be sending a morgue wagon for her now. A paramedic, rather than a boatman or a demon, was attending him. The wail was a siren. His stomach felt as if he had been clubbed mercilessly by a couple of professional thugs with big fists and lead pipes. With each beat, his heart seemed to press painfully against constricting bands, and his throat was raw. A 2-prong oxygen feed was snugged against his nasal septum. The sweet, cool flow was welcome. He could still taste the vile mess of which he had rid himself, however, and his tongue and teeth felt as if they were coated with mold. At least he wasn't vomiting anymore. Immediately at the thought of regurgitation, his abdominal muscles contracted like those of a laboratory frog zapped by an electric current, and he choked on a rising horror. What is happening to me? The paramedic snatched the oxygen feed from his patient's nose and quickly elevated his head, providing a purge towel to catch the thin ejecta. Junior's body betrayed him as before, and also in new ways that terrified and humiliated him, involving every bodily fluid except cerebrospinal. For a while, inside that rocking ambulance, he wished that he were in a gondola upon the waters of the Styx, his misery at an end. When the convulsive seizure passed and he collapsed back on the spattered pillow, shuddering at the stench rising from his hideously fouled clothes, Junior was suddenly struck by an idea that was either sheer madness or a brilliant deductive insight. Naomi, the hateful bitch, she poisoned me. The paramedic, fingers pressed to the radial artery in Junior's right wrist, must have felt a rocket-quick acceleration in his pulse rate. Junior and Naomi had taken their dried apricots from the same bag, reached in the bag without looking, shook them out into the palms of their hands. She could not have controlled which pieces of fruit he received and which she ate. Did she poison herself as well? Was it her intention to kill him and commit suicide? Not cheerful, life-loving, high-spirited, church-going Naomi. She saw every day through a golden haze that came from the sun in her heart. He had once spoken that very sentiment to her. Golden haze, sun in the heart. His words had melted her, tears had sprung into her eyes, and the sex had been better than ever. More likely the poison had been in his cheese sandwich or in his water bottle. His heart rebelled at the thought of lovely Naomi committing such treachery. Sweet-tempered, generous, honest, kind Naomi had surely been incapable of murdering anyone, least of all the man she loved. Unless she hadn't loved him. The paramedic pumped the inflation cuff of the sphygmomanometer, and Junior's blood pressure was most likely high enough to induce a stroke, driven skyward by the thought that Naomi's love had been a lie. Maybe she had married him for his... No, that was a dead end. He didn't have any money. She had loved him, all right. She had adored him. Worshipped would not be too strong a word. Now that the possibility of treachery had occurred to Junior, however, he couldn't rid himself of suspicion. Good Naomi, who gave immeasurably more to everyone than she took, would forevermore stand in a shadow of doubt in his memory. After all, you could never really know anyone, not really know every last corner of someone's mind or heart. No human being was perfect. Even someone of saintly habits and selfless behavior might be a monster in his heart, filled with unspeakable desires, which he might act upon only once or never. He was all but certain that he himself, for example, would not kill another wife. For one thing, considering that his marriage to Naomi was now stained by the most terrible of doubts, he couldn't imagine how he might ever again trust anyone sufficiently to take the wedding vows. Junior closed his weary eyes and gratefully submitted as the paramedic wiped his greasy face and his crusted lips with a cool, damp cloth. Naomi's beautiful countenance rose in his mind, and she looked beatific for a moment, but then he thought he saw a certain slyness in her angelic smile, a disturbing glint of calculation in her once loving eyes. Losing his cherished wife was devastating, a wound beyond all hope of healing, but this was even worse, having his bright image of her stained by suspicion. Naomi was no longer present to provide comfort and consolation, and now Junior didn't even have untainted memories of her to sustain him. As always, it was not the action that troubled him, but the aftermath. This soiling of Naomi's memory was a sadness so poignant, so terrible, that he wondered if he could endure it. He felt his mouth tremble and go soft, not with the urge to throw up again, but with something like grief, if not grief itself. His eyes filled with tears. Perhaps the paramedic had given him an injection, a sedative. As the howling ambulance rocked along on this most momentous day, Junior Kane wept profoundly but quietly, and achieved temporary peace in a dreamless sleep. When he woke, he was in a hospital bed, his upper body slightly elevated. The only illumination was provided by a single window, an ashen light too dreary to be called a glow, trimmed into drab ribbons by the tilted blades of a Venetian blind. Most of the room lay in shadows. He still had a sour taste in his mouth, although it was not as disgusting as it had been. All the odors were wonderfully clean and bracing. Antiseptics, floor wax, freshly laundered bed sheets, without a whiff of bodily fluids. He was immensely weary, limp. He felt oppressed, as though a great weight were piled on him. Even keeping his eyes open was tiring. An IV rack stood beside the bed, dripping fluid into his vein, replacing the electrolytes that he had lost through vomiting, most likely medicating him with an antiemetic as well. His right arm was securely strapped to a supporting board to prevent him from bending his elbow and accidentally tearing out the needle. This was a 2-bed unit. The second bed was empty. Junior thought he was alone, but just when he felt capable of summoning the energy to shift to a more comfortable position, he heard a man clear his throat. The phlegmy sound had come from beyond the foot of the bed, from the right corner of the room. Instinctively, Junior knew that anyone watching over him in the dark could not be a person of the best intentions. Doctors and nurses didn't monitor their patients with the lights off. He was relieved that he hadn't moved his head or made a sound. He wanted to understand as much of the situation as possible before revealing that he was awake. Because the upper part of the hospital bed was somewhat raised, he didn't have to lift his head from the pillow to study the corner where the phantom waited. He peered beyond the IV rack, past the foot of the adjacent bed. Junior was lying in the darkest end of the room, farthest from the window, but the corner in question was almost equally shrouded in gloom. He stared for a long time until his eyes began to ache, before he was at last able to make out the vague angular lines of an armchair, and in the chair, a shape as lacking in detail as that of the robed and hooded gondolier on the sticks. He was uncomfortable, achy, thirsty, but he remained utterly still and observant. After a while, he realized that the sense of oppression with which he'd awakened was not entirely a psychological symptom. Something heavy lay across his abdomen, and it was cold, so cold in fact that it had numbed his middle to the extent that he hadn't immediately felt the chill of it. Shivers coursed through him. He clenched his jaws to prevent his teeth from chattering and thereby alerting the man in the chair. Although he never took his eyes off the corner, Junior became preoccupied with trying to puzzle out what was draped across his midsection. The mysterious observer made him sufficiently nervous that he couldn't order his thoughts as well as usual, and the effort to prevent the shivers from shaking a sound out of him only further interfered with his ability to reason. The longer that he was unable to identify the frigid object, the more alarmed he became. He almost cried out when into his mind oozed an image of Naomi's dead body, now past the whitest shade of pale, as gray as the faint light at the window, and turning pale green in a few places, and cold, all the heat of life gone from her flesh, which was not yet simmering with any of the heat of decomposition that would soon enliven it again. No, ridiculous. Naomi wasn't slumped across him. He wasn't sharing his bed with a corpse. That was EC comic stuff, something from a yellowed issue of Tales from the Crypt. And it wasn't Naomi sitting in the chair either. Not Naomi come to him from the morgue to wreak vengeance. The dead don't live again, neither here nor in some world beyond. Nonsense. Even if such ignorant superstitions could be true, the visitor was far too quiet and too patient to be the living dead incarnation of a murdered wife. This was a predatory silence, an animal cunning, not a supernatural hush. This was the elegant stillness of a panther in the brush, the coiled tension of a snake too vicious to give a warning rattle. Suddenly, Junior intuited the identity of the man in the chair. Beyond question, this was the plainclothes police officer with the birthmark. The salt and pepper, brush-cut hair, the pan-flat face, the thick neck. Instantly to Junior's memory came the eye floating in the port wine stain, the hard gray iris like a nail in the bloody palm of a crucified man. Draped across his midsection, the terrible cold weight had chilled his flesh, but now his bone marrow prickled with ice at the thought of the birthmark detective sitting silently in the dark, watching. Junior would have preferred dealing with Naomi, dead and risen and seriously pissed, rather than with this dangerously patient man. Chapter 10. With a crash as loud as the dire crack of heaven opening on Judgment Day, the Ford picked up broadside of the Pontiac. Agnes couldn't hear the first fraction of her scream, and not much of the rest of it either, as the car slid sideways, tipped, and rolled. The rain-washed street shimmered greasily under the tires, and the intersection lay halfway up a long hill, so gravity was aligned with fate against them. The driver's side of the Pontiac lifted. Beyond the windshield, the main drag of Bright Beach tilted crazily. The passenger side slammed against the pavement. Glass in the door next to Agnes cracked, dissolved. Pebbly blacktop like a dragon flank of glistening scales hissed past the broken window, inches from her face. Before setting out from home, Joey had buckled his lap belt, but because of Agnes's condition, she hadn't engaged her own. She rammed against the door, pain shot through her right shoulder, and she thought, "Oh Lord, the baby." Bracing her feet against the floorboards, clutching the seat with her left hand, fiercely gripping the door handle with her right, she prayed that the baby would be all right, that she would live at least long enough to bring her child into this wonderful world, into this grand creation of endless and exquisite beauty, whether she herself lived past the birth or not. Onto its roof now, the Pontiac spun as it slid, grinding loudly against the blacktop, and regardless of how determinedly Agnes held on, she was being pulled out of her seat toward the inverted ceiling, and also backward. Her forehead knocked hard into the thin overhead padding, and her back wrenched against the headrest. She could hear herself screaming once more, but only briefly, because the car was either struck again by the pickup or hit by other traffic, or perhaps it collided with a parked vehicle. But whatever the cause, the breath was knocked out of her, and her screams became ragged gasps. This second impact turned half a roll into a full 360. The Pontiac crunched onto the driver's side and jolted at last onto its four tires, jumped a curb and crumpled its front bumper against the wall of a brightly painted surfboard shop, shattering a display window. Worry Bear, big as ever behind the steering wheel, slumped sideways in his seat, with his head tipped toward her, his eyes rolled to one side, and his gaze fixed upon her, blood streaming from his nose. He said, "The baby?" "All right, I think, all right," Agnes gasped, but she was terrified that she was wrong, that the child would be stillborn or enter the world damaged. He didn't move, the Worry Bear, but lay in that curious and surely uncomfortable position, arms slack at his sides, head lolling as though it were too heavy to lift. "Let me see you." She was shaking and so afraid, not thinking clearly, and for a moment she didn't understand what he meant, what he wanted, and then she saw that the window on his side of the car was shattered too, and that the door beyond him was badly torqued, twisted in its frame. Worse, the side of the Pontiac had burst inward when the pickup plowed into them. With a steel snarl and sheet metal teeth, it had bitten into Joey, bitten deep, a mechanical shark swimming out of the wet day, shattering ribs, seeking his warm heart. "Let me see you." Joey couldn't raise his head, couldn't turn more directly toward her, because his spine had been damaged, perhaps severed, and he was paralyzed. "Oh, dear God," she whispered. And although she had always been a strong woman who stood on a rock of faith, who drew hope as well as air with every breath, she was as weak now as the unborn child in her womb, sick with fear. She leaned forward in her seat and toward him, so he could see her more directly, and when she put one trembling hand against his cheek, his head dropped forward on neck muscles as limp as rags, his chin against his chest. Cold, wind-driven rain slashed through the missing windows, and voices rose in the street as people ran toward the Pontiac, thunder in the distance, and on the air was the ozone scent of the storm, and the more subtle and more terrible odor of blood. But none of these hard details could make the moment seem real to Agnes, who, in her deepest nightmares, had never felt more like a dreamer than she felt now. She cupped his face in both of her hands and was barely able to lift his head for fear of what she would see. His eyes were strangely radiant, as she had never seen them before, as if the shining angel who would guide him elsewhere had already entered his body and was with him to begin the journey. In a voice free of pain and fear, he said, "I was loved by you." Not understanding, thinking that he was inexplicably asking if she loved him, she said, "Yes, of course, you silly bear, you stupid man, of course I love you." "It was the only dream that mattered," Joey said, "you loving me. It was a good life because of you." She tried to tell him that he was going to make it, that he would be with her for a long time, that the universe was not so cruel as to take him at 30, with all their lives ahead of them, but the truth was here to see, and she could not lie to him. With her rock of faith under her, and breathing hope as much as ever, she was nevertheless unable to be as strong for him as she wanted to be. She felt her face go soft, her mouth tremble, and when she tried to repress a sob, it burst from her with wretched force. Holding his precious face between her hands, she kissed him. She met his gaze, and furiously she blinked away her tears, for she wanted to be clear-sighted, to be looking into his eyes, to see him, the truest part of him in there beyond his eyes, until that very last moment when she could not have him any more. People were at the car windows, struggling to open the buckled doors, but Agnes refused to acknowledge them. Matching her fierce attention with the sudden intensity of his own, Joey said, "Bartholomew." They knew no one named Bartholomew, and she had never heard the name from him before, but she knew what he wanted. He was speaking of the son he would never see. "If it's a boy, Bartholomew," she promised. "It's a boy," Joey assured her. As though he had been given a vision. Thick blood sluiced across his lower lip, down his chin, bright arterial blood. "Baby, no," she pleaded. She was lost in his eyes. She wanted to pass through his eyes as Alice had passed through the looking-glass, follow the beautiful radiance that was fading now, go with him through the door that had been opened for him, and accompany him out of this rain-swept day into grace. This was his door, however, not hers. She did not possess a ticket to ride the train that had come for him. He boarded and the train was gone, and with it the light in his eyes. She lowered her mouth to his, kissing him one last time, and the taste of blood was not bitter but sacred. Chapter 11. While the slats of ash-gray light slowly lost their meager luster, and sable shadows metastasized in sinister profusion, the sentinel silence remained unbroken between Junior Kane and the birthmarked man. What might have become a waiting game of epic duration was ended when the door to the room swung inward, and a doctor in a white lab coat entered from the corridor. He was backlighted by fluorescent glare, his face in shadow like a figure in a dream. Junior closed his eyes at once and let his jaw sag, breathing through his mouth, feigning sleep. "I'm afraid you shouldn't be here," the doctor said softly. "I haven't disturbed him," said the visitor, taking his cue from the doctor and keeping his voice low. "I'm sure you haven't, but my patient needs absolute quiet and rest." "So do I," said the visitor, and Junior almost frowned at this peculiar response, wondering what was meant in addition to what was merely said. The two men introduced themselves. The physician was Dr. Jim Parkhurst. His manner was easy and affable, and his soothing voice, either by nature or by calculation, was as healing as balm. The birthmarked man identified himself as Detective Thomas Vanadium. He did not use the familiar diminutive form of his name, as had the doctor, and his voice was as uninflected as his face was flat and homely. Junior suspected that no one other than this man's mother called him Tom. He was probably detective to some and vanadium to most who knew him. "What's wrong with Mr. Kane here?" Vanadium asked. "He suffered an unusually strong episode of hematemesis. Vomiting blood. One of the paramedics used the word, but what's the cause?" "Well, the blood wasn't dark and acidic, so it didn't come from his stomach. It was bright and alkaline. It could have arisen in the esophagus, but most likely it's pharyngeal in origin. From his throat." Junior's throat felt torn inside as though he'd been snacking on cactus. "That's correct," Parkhurst said. "Probably one or more small blood vessels ruptured from the extreme violence of the emesis." "Emesis? Vomiting? I'm told it was an exceptionally violent emetic episode." "He spewed like a fire hose," Vanadium said matter-of-factly. How colorfully put. In a monotone that gave new meaning to deadpan, the detective added, "I'm the only one who was there who doesn't have a dry cleaning bill." Their voices remained soft, and neither man approached the bed. Junior was glad for the chance to eavesdrop, not only because he hoped to learn the nature and depth of Vanadium's suspicions, but also because he was curious and concerned about the cause of the disgusting and embarrassing episode that had landed him here. "Is the bleeding serious?" Vanadium inquired. "No, it's stopped. The thing now is to prevent a recurrence of the emesis, which could trigger more bleeding. He's getting anti-nausea medication and replacement electrolytes intravenously, and we've applied ice bags to his midsection to reduce the chance of further abdominal muscle spasms and to help control inflammation." Ice bags, not dead Naomi, just ice. Junior almost laughed at his tendency to morbidness and self-dramatization. The living dead had not come to get him, just some rubber ice bags. "So the vomiting caused the bleeding," Vanadium said. "But what caused the vomiting?" "We'll do further testing, of course, but not until he's been stabilized at least 12 hours. Personally, I don't think we'll find any physical cause. Most likely this was psychological. Acute nervous anemus caused by severe anxiety, the shock of losing his wife, seeing her die." "Exactly, the shock, the devastating loss." Junior felt it now anew. and was afraid he might betray himself with tears, although he seemed to be done with vomiting. He had learned many things about himself on this momentous day, that he was more spontaneous than he had ever before realized, that he was willing to make grievous short-term sacrifices for long-term gain, that he was bold and daring, but perhaps the most important lesson was that he was a more sensitive person than he previously perceived himself to be, and that this sensitivity, while admirable, was liable to undo him unexpectedly and at inconvenient times. To Dr. Parkhurst, Vanadium said, "In my work, I see lots of people who've just lost loved ones. None of them has ever puked like Vesuvius." "It's an uncommon reaction," the physician acknowledged, "but not so uncommon as to be rare." Could he have taken something to make himself vomit? Parkhurst sounded genuinely perplexed. Why on earth would he do that? To fake acute nervous emesis? Still pretending sleep, Junior delighted in the realization that the detective himself had dragged a red herring across the trail and was now busily following this distracting scent. Vanadium continued in his characteristic drone, a tone at odds with the colorful content of his speech. A man takes one look at his wife's body, starts to sweat harder than a copulating hog, spews like a frat boy at the end of a long beer-chugging contest, and chucks till he chucks up blood. That's not the response of your average murder. Murder? They say the railing was rotten. It was, but maybe that's not the whole story. Anyway, we know the usual poses these guys strike, the attitudes they think are deceptive and clever. Most of them are so obvious they might as well just stick their willy in a light socket and save us a lot of trouble. This, however, is a new approach, tends to make you want to believe in the poor guy. Hasn't the sheriff's department already reached a determination of accidental death? Parkhurst asked. They're good men, good cops, every last one of them, said Vanadium. And if they've got more pity in them than I do, that's a virtue, not a shortcoming. What could Mr. Kane have taken to make himself vomit? Listening to you long enough would do it, Junior thought. Parkhurst protested, but if the sheriff's department thinks it's an accident... You know how we operate in the state, Doctor. We don't waste our energy fighting over jurisdiction. We cooperate. The sheriff can decide not to put a lot of his limited resources into this, and no one will blame him. He can call it an accident and close the case, and he won't get his hackles up if we at the state level still want to poke around a little. Even though the detective was on the wrong track, Junior was beginning to feel aggrieved. As any good citizen, he was willing, even eager, to cooperate with responsible policemen who conducted their investigation by the book. This Thomas Vanadium, however, in spite of his monotonous voice and drab appearance, gave off the vibes of a fanatic. Any reasonable person would agree that the line between legitimate police inquiry and harassment was hair-thin. Vanadium asked Jim Parkhurst, "Isn't there something called Ipecac, I-P-E-C-A-C?" Yes, the dried root of a Brazilian plant, the Ipecacuanha. It induces vomiting with great effectiveness. The active ingredient is a powdered white alkaloid called emetine. This is an over-the-counter drug, isn't it? Yes, in syrup form. It's a good item for your home medicine chest in case your child ever swallows poison and you need to purge it from him quickly. Could have used a bottle of that myself last November. You were poisoned? In that slow, flat delivery with which Junior was becoming increasingly impatient, Detective Vanadium said, "We all were, Doctor. It was another election year, remember? More than once during that campaign I could have chugged Ipecac. What else would work if I wanted to have a good vomit? Well, apomorphine hydrochloride. Harder to get than Ipecac. Yes. Sodium chloride will work too. Common salt. Mix enough of it with water and it's generally effective. harder to detect than ipecac or amomorphine hydrochloride. Detect? Parkhurst asked. In the spew. In the vomitus, you mean? Sorry, I forget we're in polite company. Yes, I mean in the vomitus. Well, the lab could detect abnormally high salt levels, but that wouldn't matter in court. He could say he ate a lot of salty foods. Salt water would be too cumbersome anyway. He'd have to drink a lot of it shortly before he heaved, but he was surrounded by cops with good reason to keep an eye on him. Does ipecac come in capsule form? I suppose anyone could fill some empty gelatin capsules with the syrup, said Parkhurst, but roll your own, so to speak. Then he could palm a few of them, swallow them without water, and the reaction would be delayed maybe long enough until the capsules dissolved in his stomach. The affable physician sounded as though he was at last beginning to find the detective's unlikely theory and persistent questioning to be tedious. I seriously doubt that a dose of ipecac would produce such a violent response as in this case. Not pharyngeal hemorrhage, for God's sake. Ipecac is a safe product. If you took triple or quadruple the usual dose, wouldn't matter, Parkhurst insisted. A lot has pretty much the same effect as a little. You can't overdose, because what it does is make you throw up, and when you throw up, you purge yourself of the ipecac along with everything else. Then, whether a little or a lot, it'll be in his spew, his vomitus. If you're expecting the hospital to provide a sample of the ejecta, I'm afraid... Ejecta? The vomitus. Vanadium said, I'm an easily confused layman, doctor. If we can't stick to one word for it, I'm just going to go back to spew. The paramedics will have disposed of the contents of the emesis basin if they used one, and if there were soiled towels or sheeting, they might already have been laundered. That's all right, Vanadium said. I bagged some at the scene. Bagged as evidence. Junior felt unspeakably violated. This was outrageous. The inarguably personal, very private contents of his stomach scooped into a plastic evidence bag without his permission, without even his knowledge. What next? A stool sample pried out of him while he was knocked unconscious by morphine? This barf gathering surely was in violation of the Constitution of the United States. A clear contravention of the guarantee against self-incrimination, a slap in the face of justice, a violation of the rights of man. He had not, of course, taken ipecac or any other emetic, so they would find no evidence to use against him. He was angry nonetheless as a matter of principle. Perhaps Dr. Parkhurst, too, was disturbed by this fascistic and fanatical spew sampling because he became brusque. I have a few appointments to keep. By the time I make evening rounds, I expect Mr. Kane to be conscious, but I'd rather you didn't disturb him until tomorrow. Instead of responding to the physician's request, Vanadium said, One more question, doctor. If this was acute nervous emesis, as you suggest, couldn't there have been another cause besides his anguish over the traumatic loss of his wife? I can't imagine any more obvious source of extreme anxiety. Guilt, said the detective. If he killed her, wouldn't an overwhelming sense of guilt be as likely as anguish to cause acute nervous emesis? I couldn't say with any confidence. None of my degrees is in psychology. Humor me with an educated guess, doctor. I'm a healer, not a prosecutor. I'm not in the habit of making accusations, especially not against my own patients. Wouldn't dream of asking you to make it a habit, just this one time. If anguish, why not guilt? Dr. Parkhurst considered the question, which she ought to have dismissed out of hand. Well, yes, I suppose so. Spineless, unethical quack bastard, Junior thought bitterly. I believe I'll just wait here until Mr. Kane wakes, Vanadium said. I have nothing more pressing to do. An authoritative note came into Parkhurst's voice, that Emperor of the Universe tone that probably was taught in a special medical school course on intimidation, though he was striking this attitude a little too late to be entirely effective. My patient is in a fragile state. He mustn't be agitated, Detective. I really don't want you questioning him until tomorrow at the earliest. All right, of course, I won't question him. I'll just observe. Judging by the sounds Vanadium made, Junior figured that the cop had settled once more into the armchair. Junior hoped that Parkhurst was more skilled at the practice of medicine than he was at browbeating. After a long hesitation, the physician said, "You could switch on that lamp." "I'll be fine. It won't disturb the patient." "I like the dark," Vanadium replied. "This is most irregular." "Isn't it, though?" Vanadium agreed. Finally wimping out completely, Parkhurst left the room. The heavy door sighed softly shut, silencing the squeak of rubber-soled shoes, the swish of starched uniforms, and other noises made by the busy nurses in the corridor. Mrs. Kane's little boy felt small, weak, sorry for himself, and terribly alone. The detective was still here, but his presence only aggravated Junior's sense of isolation. He missed Naomi. She'd always known exactly the right thing to say or do, improving his mood with a few words or with just her touch when he was feeling down.